Chapter 1. Color. Stewart sat in his blank office cubicle. It had been several hours since break, and he desperately wanted to stop and enjoy the nice weather outside. He turned to stare out the windows, gazed upon the busy streets below, and smiled somberly. Everyone had a place they needed to be. Nobody bothered to look around anymore. He continued to work on his office work and observed the crinkles on the pages he signed. Another somber smile from the employee, and a sigh that made even the white cubicle feel small. Interestingly, everything in Stewart's world was white. No gradients, and no extra colors except the black outlines signifying corners and lines, much like a coloring book. Stewart was also made up of intricate black lines and white filling, which to him made his existence sad. He knew color existed, like everyone else, but they didn't know what it looked like nor what it would be like to see anything beyond the bright white everything. Stewart stopped typing and put his head in his hands, this time causing his thick black lines to slump in the chair he sat in. The depressing, anxiety-inducing white place made him feel nauseous as he worked. The other employees would frequently tease Stewart for being sick of how the world looked. "How silly you are being," they would say as they sipped their black coffee in white cups. "Stop overthinking. It will lead you to trouble if you are not careful." Stewart always disregarded their comments and, instead of working, would read every shred of evidence that color was real. He studied color theory, color charts, though they all appeared as white, shading, and tinting. When his shift was over for the day, he carefully placed the completed files full of boring legal text in a stack and placed them in a bin outside of his cubicle, where his manager would use them for evaluation. Any mistakes in the paperwork would result in an immediate discharge and a severe payment cut, so completing them correctly the first time was critical. He stepped out of the building and breathed a deep breath of fresh air. He reached into his bag, pulled out his book about color, and read it intensely as he walked down the sidewalk. As he walked, he learned about how the value of the color, the hue, and the chroma all worked together to form what people perceived as color. He stopped and strained his eyes, desperately trying to see what the book had told him. Though he tried hard, he could not see the color the book had led him to believe. Stewart threw the book in the trash, disappointed in how little it described. Another useless theory book. He wondered if the books were even telling the truth. Perhaps his fellow colleagues were right. Perhaps color had never existed and they all truly lived in a black and white world. Perhaps help! Stewart looked up from his thoughts, and before him was a young girl panting exceedingly hard, almost as if she had been running for many miles. There was a figure running toward them down the blank sidewalk, but he couldn't make out who it was. Stewart looked down at his legs where the young girl stood for a moment, then saw a cop running towards them. The girl grabbed his legs and sobbed, "Please don't let them take me. I'm innocent. I wouldn't." "Now that's enough, you!" snarled the female cop who had just approached the young girl. "You have stolen property. Give it back or face the consequences." "But it's so pretty," sobbed the young girl, but the officer aggressively grabbed her arm and peeled her off of Stewart's legs, and she dragged the young girl away from Stewart. The young girl bawled her eyes out and kicked her legs, tried her hardest to break the officer's grip. Stewart shook his head sadly and continued to walk down the street. It was a shame that even a child could be accused of crime these days, but there was nothing he could do about it. She had broken the law. It was her problem. He couldn't be responsible for her actions. Stewart went up to an apartment complex and stepped inside the white door. A harsh blast of cold greeted him upon entering. The apartment front desk had turned on their industrial freezer again. He chuckled to himself slightly while shivering violently as his body tried its hardest to stay warm. He walked up a flight of stairs and reached into his pocket for his keys when he reached his room number. When he located them, he inserted one into the lock and opened the door. Then he jumped back in surprise as a blossom of what could only be described as magic spread across his door from where he had inserted his key. Though he didn't know it, the door was turning a dusty yellow birch, making him panic, for he had never truly seen color before. He immediately pulled his key out, and the color slowly faded from the door's surface, returning to the familiar black and white. He turned to stare at the key, which was shimmering a bright golden glow, and jumped in surprise upon seeing a patch of something spreading across his coloring book fingers. He dropped the keys, shook his hand as if he had been badly burned. When he looked down, however, the glowing keys had begun to spread color onto the floor. The faded reds and greens of the carpet below his feet seeped out of the keys like a puddle of oil spilled on the floor. Stewart frowned and slowly picked up the keys, and just as quickly as the color had spread, the floor returned to how it had been before. Curiosity had gotten the better of him, and he touched things with the keys. First the walls, then the sconces lining the halls, the ceiling, and the floor. The discovery of color was far more overwhelming than Stewart could have realized, though he still wasn't sure what he had discovered yet. He quickly unlocked his apartment room and tested the various objects he possessed, such as a mirror, a piano, which to his disappointment stayed relatively the same, an apple, a kitchen island, a photo of his wife and kids, and another photo of a black abyss. Vibrance covered the various surfaces in the room as the keys touched each one by one. However, nothing happened when he touched the walls again. Stewart frowned and touched his keys against the mirror again. Nothing. He frantically tested the apple, the piano, and the kitchen island, and he sighed heavily, collapsing onto his couch. The best moment of his life had happened, and he hadn't taken the time to work out what he had experienced. He got up, went to the kitchen, opened his fridge, stared at all the blank fruit and vegetables inside. He walked over to the mirror and got undressed, to change into his nightly attire, which comprised of his favorite robe and sleep mask. He picked up his pants and shirt and promptly brought them over to the laundry chute, but he stopped once again upon spotting a strange glowing patch of something that he could only describe as magic. Immediately his heart filled with hope and a curiosity enveloped his being. His pants had a massive blotch of blue slowly bleeding across its surface. He frowned and pressed the jeans against the wall, and a vibrant blue wallpaper slowly spread across the wall's surface. The fine details changed into an intricate golden leaves and interconnected vines. Stewart stared at the jeans and noticed the blue seemed to come from the right pocket. He reached inside and located a spherical object, and when he pulled it out of his pocket, immediately a bright light radiated throughout his room, and color filled everything around him. What was happening? He stared in wonder at the beautiful glowing in his hand and looked at it curiously. What was it? He gazed at it in wonder as its glow filled every white space and completed every object within its glow. He had to show this to someone. He was about to get up and show his newfound treasure to his roommate when a loud pounding on the door echoed menacingly within his room. "Open up!" snarled a voice, the angry, strict voice of the cop from earlier dripping with vengeance as she spoke. She was here for the orb. Stewart immediately shoved the strange orb into his pant pocket, and the room slowly changed to the coloring book world it had been before. Please, Mr. Stewart," came the voice of the front desk clerk. You have a contraband item. Please open your door before Madam Enforcement makes me do it myself." "That's right," spat Madam Enforcement. "Open up! We already know you're in there. We already know you have the orb. Give it back, now!" Stewart panicked again. He did not know what to do. She must have seen the color bleed out of his pants when the orb had been there. There was no way of getting out of it. He remembered what had happened to the young girl, making him even more worried. He tried to muster up the courage to open that door, but how could he? He was scared and didn't know what to do with himself. For the first time in his life, he had discovered something beyond what he thought possible, and Madam Enforcement wanted to take it away. Had he been smart, he would never have opened that door. He would have fled if he had had the chance. He closed his eyes and unlocked his door, and Madam Enforcement grabbed him firmly by the shoulder and shouted, "Don't disobey my command again!" She searched him, and after a couple moments, she got in his face. "Where is it?" she snarled. What?" stammered Stewart, though his hands were shaking violently as he did so. "You know what?" snarled Madam Enforcement through gritted teeth. A moment later, her large muscular arm came swinging around, and Stewart received the full blow of her athletic arm. "Let me make one thing very clear," said Madam Enforcement sharply. "If you are hiding it from me and you get out of this one clean, I will hunt you down until the day you die. I will be there the day you draw your last breath and pass out of this world." She spat in front of him, and after a second of staring him down harshly, walked away. Stewart knew the government was corrupt, but it never had occurred to him how strict they had truly become. He turned to the desk clerk, who smiled grimly at Stewart, and through his black lines, Stewart almost saw a look of pity behind them, a suggestion perhaps of things to come. He put his hands in his pockets and said, Stewart, don't make me do this. What do you mean? Asked Stewart, who was still stuttering every few syllables when he spoke. I know you have the orb, said the desk clerk. Hand it over and we can call this even. I will hand it over to Madam Enforcement and you will get off free. Stewart stopped for a moment, then asked, Are you certain? I'm certain, replied the clerk with a smile. Now hand me the orb. Stewart was about to reach into his pocket when he stopped. He wasn't certain why, but he felt resistance. Not a physical resistance, but rather a mental one that caused him to stand there for a few seconds, staring off into space. Well? Asked the clerk impatiently. Hand it over. No, murmured Stewart. He knew he couldn't lie to someone with this level of rank, though he had never met her before. Madam Enforcement evidently wasn't one to mess with. Stewart, let's not get ahead of ourselves, replied the clerk. Hand it over. Now. No, repeated Stewart. Why would you want it anyway? You're just a desk clerk. The clerk's eyes narrowed and he whispered, Stewart, you don't want Madam Enforcement to come back here, do you? All of his concern, stutter, and kindness had all but left him. What do you want with it? Asked Stewart, and upon hearing this, the clerk gave a repulsive smile and said, That is none of your concern. Give me the orb. He lunged at Stewart, and with his hands outstretched as he tried to grab it from him. No! Shouted Stewart, who tried to keep the only hope he had ever seen in his life out of the reach of the desk clerk. Immediately, the thunderous footsteps of Madam Enforcement could be heard as she marched her way up the stairs. Listen, Stewart, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, replied the clerk angrily as his face melted away to reveal another face covered in jagged cracks. The choice is yours. The pounding of Madam Enforcement's footsteps got closer and closer. Stewart's heart rate was steadily increasing as he tried to stand. He was feeling dizzy, almost as if he were about to pass out, and the next thing he knew, Madam Enforcement's fist came around for another punch, and a moment later, everything went dark. Very dark, as the world faded from the physical into the cognitive. And there he remained, trapped in a suffocating, endless dark.